when you do precognitive dream work, you see how your life is this landscape of these irreducible little details that seem trivial on the surface, but are really full of significance and meaning.
Welcome to Thresholds of Consciousness. In this episode, I interview author Eric Wargo, PhD. Eric Wargo is a multidisciplinary researcher and author on edge science topics. He has written several books on precognition, including the acclaimed Time Loops, Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious, Precognitive Dream Work and the Long Self, and Where Was It Before the Dream? Wargo received a PhD in cultural anthropology from Emory University in 2000, but left academia to work as a writer and editor. In addition to grounding his research in the latest discoveries and theorizing in physics, he draws on psychoanalytic theory, literary approaches, and Zen Buddhist philosophy, among other frameworks. Let's get into the interview with Dr. Wargo. You have the academic background of an anthropologist, and here you are writing. You're a tremendous writer, by the way. I just thought I want you to know that you're very enjoyable to read. And so you've been writing and working with precognitive dream work, retrocausation, time loops. How did you get from anthropology to that material?
Yeah, well, when I finished my PhD in 2000, I was not suited. It was pretty clear I was not suited for the academic world. I sort of managed to complete my dissertation and get my degree, but I was, a life at a university was not for me. So I wound up doing what a lot of people with PhDs and, who don't go into academia do, which is become a writer-editor. And I moved to Washington, D.C., which is full of young people with PhDs who were working as writers and editors for nonprofits and for the government and so on. And so I worked as an editor and a science editor. I worked for several years at a major scientific psychology organization, editing journal articles and stuff. And in that time, towards the end of the aughts, I started getting interested in ESP research. It actually started, I had a UFO encounter. I mean, I've said this on other podcasts, but I say encounter, it was a sighting. I saw a UFO in 2009, and that got me really interested in the topic of ufology. And when you start going down that rabbit hole, you very quickly find yourself in the company of very smart people who take psychic phenomena seriously, and I had never taken psychic phenomena seriously. In fact, my father was a scientific psychologist, and scientific psychologists are the most hostile to the existence of ESP or claims of any kind of parapsychological claim, is regarded as pseudoscience by scientific psychologists. So this was kind of a bit of a cognitive dissonance for me. But I did my due diligence in reading about the science of parapsychology, which I knew nothing about until then, and realized, there is a science here, and there's a lot of evidence, and it's just the evidence is just ignored. And so, as an anthropologist by training, that is really what almost grabbed me more than even the evidence was what is so taboo about this? Why was my initial reaction kind of a visceral repugnance, and why do scientific psychologists, I won't say scientists because a lot of scientists are very open to this stuff, but psychologists, why are they so hostile to this topic? Why do ordinary people who experience psychic ESP things, who have, inexplicable experiences, why do they feel shy to talk about them? Why, what is this cloak of taboo that surrounds what I came to realize is a whole vast, scientifically uncharacterized but very real domain of human cognitive functioning. And so that story of kind of exclusion and repression, in a way, really kind of gripped me as much as the evidence. And in addition to the evidence, I was realizing, I've had these experiences and I've just swept them under the rug, which is what you do when you don't have a mental framework or a cultural framework in which to situate, something like a dream that comes true the next day. What do you do with that? And, I'd had those dreams, and in fact, I'd been a assiduous dream recorder for decades, actually, because of my long-standing interest in psychoanalysis. So I had kept a long-term dream record, and I had precognitive dreams, but I just ignored them. So it was particularly the topic of precognition and the evidence for precognition that really, most excited me, because it's, of all, ESP is traditionally divided into three modalities, ostensible modalities. There's telepathy, which is sort of mind-to-mind contact. Clairvoyance, which is now called remote viewing, which is, just sort of seeing things that are hidden or at a distance. And precognition, which is seeing things in the future somehow. And ordinary people and even parapsychologists don't have a problem conceptualizing the first two, because they don't, even though they seem remarkable, they don't seem completely impossible somehow. You can imagine ways in which they could work mechanistically, but precognition just defies all of our assumptions about causality and time. And yet it has the strongest evidence supporting it, and it's the most common sort of paranormal experience for a person to have is a precognitive experience or a precognitive dream. In fact, I would say that really the most common is what we ordinarily call synchronicity. When people have a meaningful coincidence, because no one thinks in terms of precognition, we don't even really have, most people haven't even ever heard that term. They don't have a mental box to put meaningful coincidences into, but they know this term synchronicity, and so they'll call it a synchronicity. But I'd say those are generally precognitive experiences. I think it's a part of everyday life, which for really interesting cultural and historical reasons has been excluded from science and excluded from polite company for centuries. And so that really, I think, interests me. That exclusion, that repression really interests me, almost as much as the phenomenon itself.
So there's so much there I could ask about. I'm sure we'll get more into the precognitive dreams. I want to ask you, what's your sense? What did you come up with in regards to an answer for that question? Why is there this repression that's happened? I mean, I could throw a theory out. I'm imagining this is something you've spent a lot of time thinking about. So I wonder what you have to say to that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of real estate in my first book Time Loops is devoted to this question, and I address it sort of in the context of Sigmund Freud, because he was the great pioneer in thinking about repression on an individual level, and thinking about taboo and so on. And he although his relevance has, is practically nil in mainstream psychiatry, he remains, or at least remained, very relevant in anthropology when I was studying that field. And so, we read a lot of Freud and Lacan and other theorists in that tradition, and his insights. He's often sort of reduced and ridiculed for his obsession with sex and things like that. But his basic insights into the unconscious and sort of symbolism and taboo and his overall meta-psychology, that is to say, his sort of iceberg model of, consciousness, preconscious, unconscious, and the way unconscious interacts with consciousness is incredibly relevant, I believe. And in fact, neuroscientists are actually coming around to that realization that he mapped out, a lot of what neuroscience has discovered about the brain. He mapped it out, a century before they could validate it with neuroimaging. So there's sort of a renaissance of Freud among neuroscientists right now. But I think that metapsychology I talked about is actually a ready-made theory of precognition, actually. And Freud himself did not believe in precognition, and to his detriment. But he, I think, gave us a very strong, powerful model that can be adapted very readily to understanding precognition. But that doesn't really answer your question. Your question is, well, why is this topic so repressed? That goes back to the late Renaissance, really. Up until the 16th century, when science as we know it was sort of becoming born, with those great figures that we sort of associate with the early sciences, Copernicus, Galileo, and so on. The sciences were being born there, and one of the major figures was Francis Bacon, who sort of codified the rules of scientific thinking in I forget his classic book, but he basically took there had been up until that point, Aristotle back in Greece had codified 4 different kinds of causation. Okay. There was efficient causation, which is the kind of causation, the kind of billiard ball, one thing leading to another that we understand. And then there were 2 others. And then there was teleological causation, that is to say, the purpose or destiny of a thing. Well, Francis Bacon basically said we have to get rid of that one. Okay, we have to get rid of teleology. And the reason was that at the time, the only teleology that they could imagine was God's divine plan, all right? And in the new rules of science, you couldn't bring God in. I mean, these guys all believed in God, as sort of an original creator, but to understand the natural world, it was no fair invoking miracles. So you had to basically leave God out of your equations and really understand how physical processes worked and unfolded. And so they rejected any idea of kind of the destiny or fate of something kind of acting back on it. And so that really held as like one of the number one principles or rules of scientific reasoning, okay, for the next 4 centuries, 5 centuries, 4 centuries, I think. and it worked very well. It suited the early sciences and the emerging sciences of. Well, at that time, it was not called science. It was not called science until the 19th century, but the natural philosophy. It suited those inquiries, Isaac Newton's studies of, light and gravity and so on. It suited it very well to just focus on that obvious, efficient causation aspect of causality. The idea, again, how things mechanistically unfold in time. And it very well suited the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th century, the rise of machines, okay? And, we have all these machine models that are still kind of dominant in the way we think about the natural world, not the way maybe quantum physicists think about the natural world, but the way most ordinary people think about the natural world is as a kind of big machine, just a really, really complex machine. And now one of the aspects of that machine model was, theoretically, if it holds, then theoretically you should be able to predict everything that happens. Or you should imagine being able to predict any event in nature if you somehow had a God's eye view of everything that had come before. All right. Well, that assumption broke down about a little over a century ago, with the emergence of what we now call quantum physics. The study of matter and energy at the smallest scales of interactions between particles, basically. There was a causal remainder there that couldn't be accounted for through efficient causation. And this is boom. This was the kind of trauma, to use a Freudian word, trauma that basically gave birth to what we now call quantum physics. But there was no agreement, and there still isn't, about, well, what is that remainder? What counts for what looks to our eyes like randomness or some statistical probabilistic element at the smallest scales? What is it that explains that? How do we account for that? Well, there were all kinds of theories. In the 1920s, there were all kinds of proposals for what could account for that looseness, that randomness, that random element. And in fact, one of the hypotheses offered was, what we would now call, what then would be called teleology, and what now we call retrocausation. The idea that a particle's behavior at time point X is not only determined by all the particles that it interacted with up until that point, but it's also to some extent determined by the next thing it's going to interact with in time, okay, which is mind-blowing to think about, because we're not cognitively and certainly not culturally set up to think in retrocausal terms. But this idea is actually right there in the equations that govern physical processes. There's a retrograde component of these equations which gets kind of just tossed out because, well, that's obviously impossible, and it's just a kind of vestige of our math, and we just can ignore it. Well, some physicists thought, no, maybe the answer is here, but it was so hard to think, hard to conceptualize. And there were other proposals, including the one that became dominant for the bulk of the 20th century, which was the so-called Copenhagen interpretation. And now this is associated most closely with Niels Bohr, who is from Denmark. And so, it's sort of his interpretation, but he and his sort of followers said, well, you just have to accept that the world is random on the smallest scales. You just have to accept it. It's just this baffling part of nature, and you just have to accept that it's random, and don't try to interpret it. Don't try to interpret it further. You just you just have to wrap your head around this. Now, a lot of physicists couldn't wrap their heads around it. And most famously, Einstein couldn't wrap his head around it. He never wrapped his head around that. He said God does not play dice. This was an ongoing debate between him and Bohr about the fundamental nature of reality. Einstein, just didn't believe it. Well, all along the way, there were dissenters, okay? And including in the 1950s, there were a couple of dissenters saying, wait a minute, maybe this old idea of retrocausation is really the answer. But again, they got kind of silenced and marginalized because Niels Bohr was this very powerful personality, okay? It was mostly the force of his personality that kind of he pulled together all the physicists and into agreement on this one, interpretation. And anyway, so it had the effect of silencing all counter interpretations. The idea reemerged in the 60s, and then the 90s. And actually, since the 90s, it has really more and more physicists are rejecting the Copenhagen interpretation, and there are now multiple interpretations out there that are sort of vying for supremacy. The many worlds is one that you've probably heard of. The idea that at every decision point in nature, nature branches into some new timeline, and so we have practically infinite timelines and so on. But retrocausation is another one, another increasingly viable and popular interpretation of the so-called quantum measurement problem. That's the way they phrase it. And more experiments are now showing what looks like retrocausation in the physical world. And my money is on this paradigm because it alone, among all the other interpretations of quantum physics, opens up an explanation for these so-called psi phenomena that there's so much evidence for. And here's where you get, some people will focus on things like telepathy and say, well, quantum entanglement explains it and so on. I disagree with those people. I think that the fundamental thing is temporal, and that this fundamental spooky relationship is really a temporal relationship, and that is to say that the future is influencing the present to a degree. Now, there's probably an asymmetry there. It's probably a smaller degree than the past influencing the present, but it's nevertheless a real component. And thus what we have been seeing as randomness, as the statistical aspect of the quantum world, is really evidence for retrocausation. And moreover, there is growing evidence from the field of quantum biology that biological systems scale up these spooky quantum effects, and such that you could have physical systems that are pre-spawning to a future stimulus, and that's what I think is the roots of precognition. I think we are at the point where we can offer a plausible physical theory of how precognition works and how precognitive dreams work and so on, and so I have written about this at length in various books. But I think it requires, really flipping your assumptions about causation and what causation is. But it very, very elegantly solves a lot of century-old problems in quantum physics, and in the same stroke, it sort of unifies parapsychology and psychoanalysis and physics. It's like really, an elegant, beautiful synthesis, I think. So my mission in life has been to convince people of that and say, hey, let's let's look at things through this other lens of retrocausation. So that was a long answer. Sorry, I give long answers.
Well, I love that, and you make a compelling case for these for retrocausation in all of your material. And I wonder if you could just can you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by a time loop, because that was really one of your seminal works and foundational works was your book Time Loops. Can you just explain that? I mean, I know you're already starting to touch on it with retrocausation, but just kind of explain that, and maybe you can give a real example of what that is, just so people who are sort of not privy to that will
absolutely
have a concrete
Right. So this is I think the most interesting entailment of the existence of retrocausation and precognition in the lives of especially freely willed creatures such as ourselves, and it also really links back to that question of taboo, because it is this time looping aspect that causes people to have smoke shoot out their ears and go, no, we can't, this is impossible. But really it's the most fascinating dimension of it, and this is I think my kind of small contribution to this topic, because lots of people have made different parts of the argument before. I'm certainly not the first person to argue for the existence of precognition, or talk about precognitive dreams, or talk about retrocausation, or whatever. But this aspect of time loops is what is key. So let me explain what I mean by that. If you have a world that includes any kind of time travel, all right, which is what we're talking about. When we're talking about retrocausation, it's simply a form of informational time travel. Information is just causation by another name, okay? And it's a popular way of talking about the physical universe, for the last 3 decades or so, 4 decades, has been in terms of information, and it's given rise to quantum computing and so on. But you're really talking about causation when you're talking about information. And so what you're talking about with retrocausation is basically information traveling from the future to the past. Now, what that implies in, say, the life of a human being is what happens if you have a dream about a future event, like a car crash, that you could act to avert, okay? And say, oh, I had a dream I was in a car accident, so I'm not going to drive my car today, okay? And say that accident doesn't happen. Well, then that's a paradox. That's an example. That's another way of framing the so-called grandfather paradox in science fiction. The idea of going back in time, killing your grandfather so that you're not alive, so that you're never born, so you couldn't go back in time to kill your grandfather. And that's truly impossible. And that's truly paradoxical. And it's there where, some people will invoke the many worlds interpretation and say, well, every time you have time travel, you spark a new timeline. And there's a lot of science fiction stories that make use of that trope and so on. But physicists and careful physicists and philosophers and thinkers know that that's a mirage, that in fact, information can travel in time all it wants to, and whatever effect was produced in the past simply is part of your backstory in the present. So certain things like killing your grandfather can't happen because they didn't happen. Okay, it didn't happen that you went back in time and killed your grandfather. So no amount of thinking of like, well, I could go back in time and kill my grandfather, that's not going to have any effect, because it's just, it can't happen, so you're not even going to try. And if you tried, you'd wind up killing the wrong guy, or the bullet would, gun would misfire, whatever. It's just not part of your backstory. But that doesn't prohibit all kinds of retrocausation being part of history. History could be full of actual physical time travelers that have gone back in time and committed all kinds of mayhem, and that mayhem is simply part of our backstory right now. We just don't know it. So really, we're talking about what we know about the past, not what actually happened in the past. And our knowledge of the past is always very incomplete and inaccurate. Okay, so let's give an example of a time loop. A time loop is when you have a future event causing something in the past, which then winds up causing that future event. And the very best example of this is the famous scarab story in Carl Jung's book Synchronicity. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know this story or have heard it at some point because it's probably the most famous thing Carl Jung ever wrote. He was treating a patient, and we actually now know a lot about this patient, and we can talk about that. But he was treating a patient probably in about 1920. And this young woman was, laying there on his couch, and she was very inaccessible. She was very rational, hyper-rational. She wasn't open to the kind of mystical stuff that he was really getting interested in, about the collective unconscious and archetypes and myth and all that. She was kind of closed off. But she comes into his office one day and says, geez, I had this dream where someone gave me this this piece of costly golden jewelry in the shape of a scarab beetle. Okay. And right as she's telling this dream, he hears a scratching at the window behind him, and he turns around, and on the glass outside the window is a rose chafer beetle, which is the kind of Central European counterpart of the dung beetle in Egypt. It's sort of the local scarab. Okay, so he being the shaman that he was, he unhesitatingly opened the window, took the beetle, handed it to this patient, and said, "Here's your scarab." Okay, well, this gets written about and talked about as this synchronicity, that's like, whoa, this symbol of rebirth shows up at the window, right at the moment she's talking about rebirth. And of course, him giving her this scarab has the effect of opening her up. It's mind-blowing for both of them, and especially for the patient. And suddenly she's open to his therapeutic interventions and whatnot. And he sort of gives a bit of he wouldn't say cosmic, but I would say cosmic significance to this. He waffled on what the nature of archetypes was and the collective unconscious, but he did say at times that the collective unconscious can reach into physical reality and shape things. So in his view, something about that moment, something about her needs, drew that beetle to the window, and he capitalized on that moment and to effect a kind of therapeutic cure, But honestly, anyone who's studied the literature of precognitive dreams, which he had, he just didn't make the connection, would see that as a very typical precognitive dream, or what I would call a Dunn dream. J.W. Dunn, who I write about in all my books, was the pioneer in the study of precognition. And he, noticed in his own life and then in the life of friends that we very commonly have dreams that are about something that's about to happen in our real life the next day or the next few days. And it's actually a common phenomenon. It's nothing weird, and usually the phenomenon is not something earth-shattering. It may be something very simple like an encounter with an animal. So Carl Jung didn't make this connection or even think about this as a precognitive dream, but that's what it was. It was a precognitive dream. Now, here's the part that throws people, and here's what threw Jung. It was her telling her dream that got him to notice the beetle and to open the window and hand it to her. So without that part, he would never have done that. So thinking of this in terms of precognitive dream, like, troubles people because, well, if she hadn't told him her dream, she hadn't had the dream, he wouldn't have opened the window and handed her the beetle, and nothing, it wouldn't have happened. So it feels to people like a paradox. That feels like one of those paradoxes, but it's actually the opposite. It's actually a tautology. A tautology is a circular causal loop. Okay, well, that's what happened in his office. She has a precognitive dream. It's like all precognitive dreams. It was unclear. It was symbolic. I mean, it was, she was handed in the dream a piece of jewelry, a golden piece of jewelry in the shape of a scarab, of an Egyptian scarab. And in real life, her therapist, who was very important to her, handed her a wriggling, iridescent green rose chafer beetle, which is not the same thing as a scarab, but he explained to her that this is the local equivalent of the scarab beetle. And then he proceeded to explain to her its significance in Egyptian religion. So essentially, this is a time loop. This is exactly what I mean by a time loop, that you have a precognitive experience, which is information refluxing in time from the future to the present. And then on the basis of that information, you take an action which somehow has the effect of leading to the event that you've precognized. Okay, so it's a causally circular situation. If you drill down sort of forensically into almost any precognitive experience, you'll find this same logic operating. Maybe not as obviously. Oftentimes our dreams don't get us to take actions other than to write down the dream. But very often when we have precognitive dreams, and this is something that I can verify in my own life and in the lives of many other precognitive dreamers I've worked with over the last several years, very often the dream will include a kind of symbol or representation of the fact that you precognitively dreamed it. There's like a fractal quality to a lot of precognitive dreams. That is essentially an example of that time looping quality. If you had not noticed it was a precognitive dream, you wouldn't have had that dream element in your experience. But this plays out in all kinds of interesting ways, and we could spend hours just talking about what this says about free will and the ability to change the future when you act upon, say, a dream about a car accident or something like that. It becomes very subtle, but it's in those subtleties, again, that Freud's ideas about symbolic transformation of reality into the dream symbol really take on new relevance. Freud thought that dreams symbolize inner conflicts and events because we can't bring ourselves to think about them, because they're a taboo again. It's something, secretly, desiring your mother or whatever, is the kind of thing that will be symbolized. It'll be transformed into a dream symbol that won't be obvious until you engage in free association. Well, that notion, that's one of those notions of Freud that arguably can kind of be set aside, I think, because I think what's really happening is that you simply cannot have a direct and clear premonition of an event that you would act to prevent if you knew it was a premonition. So you can't have even and this includes anything, not just things like car accidents, but even things that are beneficial to us, even rewards. As Freud noticed, they make us feel guilty, and we on some level we act to thwart our own desires in all kinds of ways. This is what it means to be a neurotic for Freud, and we're all neurotic. So even if you had a precognitive dream, even if you were going to win the lottery the next day, you're not necessarily going to have a very clear unsymbolic dream about winning the lottery, or the winning lottery numbers or whatever. It's going to be distorted in some way that gets you to take the necessary actions for that event to occur, but not in a direct, clear way that you're going to be able to consciously understand until after the event has happened. And so it offers a new way of thinking about this idea of symbolic transformation that is so central for Freud. Time loops are really the most fascinating entailment of precognition in the lives of freely willed beings such as ourselves. We cannot get a clear and unmediated impression of a future event. It's always going to be disguised, symbolic, unclear in one way or another.
Fascinating stuff. So is it your sense that all dreams are precognitive? That none of them represent a kind of an internal conflict?
Well, I think those aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, dreams can certainly contain all kinds of material about our inner conflict and our pasts. They certainly contain what Freud identified as day residues, that is to say, elements of things that have happened the previous day or the previous few weeks, elements of things from our childhood and so on. They absolutely include all that stuff. The question is, do they all contain precognitive material? There would be no way of ever proving that. But it doesn't make sense that evolution would give us, the ability to reach into our future and only use it occasionally, and only use it for, kind of seemingly trivial, for the most part, seemingly trivial events, except for the occasional time you dream of a plane crash and decide not to get on the plane and it crashes. Okay, but those are the exceptions. It makes no sense that nature would, give us precognition and then not use it all the time. It makes no sense to me that this is just sort of an icing on the cake of dreams and dream work and what dreams are. So my totally unprovable hypothesis is that all dreams could be precognitive. We should certainly proceed in our dream work with that assumption that every dream potentially contains precognitive material, and thus you should never think when you wake up and do your free association or do whatever your dream work method is, assume that you've gotten to the heart of what the dream is about, because your life will, in sort of a trickster-like way, will show that you were wrong. That's another beauty of, I think, the time loops idea, is it really makes sense of that trickster phenomenon, or what Jung would call an archetype, that there's a way in which being precognitive creatures who don't understand that, who don't recognize or understand that we are precognitive beings, there's a way in which our lives have a trickster quality to them, especially if we're paying attention to things like dreams or visions and stuff like that, or creativity. Then suddenly, like, the world is suddenly this landscape of synchronicity, and it's all like there's some intelligence there that's higher than our own conscious intelligence, and it's leading us, and it's tricking us, and it's giving us all these ironies. Well, what if that's just our long self? That's what I call the long self, is this extended person through time that is, giving us precognitive experiences again and again and again on a daily basis, and we just don't recognize that it's happening. And again, it gets back to that question of taboo. Do we not recognize it's happening simply because we come from a culture that is too materialistic or too linear in its thinking to accept it? Or is there some kind of cognitive block there that's intrinsic to all humans? I think that's an open question. But so I forgot what your question was, but I hope I answered it.
Well, you're leading us in all the directions we need to go. So, so then you pull from this idea of the block theory or the block
Well,
structure of the universe.
block universe is it's sometimes called. This is just it's just a way of expressing what in based on Einstein's work they called the space-time continuum. The idea that time is just the fourth dimension. That there is actually that we actually can only define the universe in 4 dimensions, not 3. And that time is that fourth dimension. And this is what Freud's theories of special and general relativity essentially didn't prove, but established in the thinking of physicists. And that's still the way most physicists, understand the world. So it's really not a controversial part of what I'm saying at all.
Yeah.
I mean, physicists would say that the future is just as it already exists out there, and that certainly is what allows, I think, precognition to be real. It's part of what allows precognition to be real. There is an actual future from which, we can get information, but because we're freely willed beings who will try to thwart the prophecies in whatever way, that information can't reach us other than in a distorted, symbolic, fragmented way.
And that's really your reinterpretation of the Oedipus myth as well.
Right. And this is what you've read some of my work. I never get tired of Freud and Oedipus because yes, this is the true Oedipus complex. And Freud, he was obsessed with Oedipus because not because of the aspect that Freud gets a prophecy and winds up fulfilling the prophecy by trying to evade it, but he's obsessed simply with the crimes that Oedipus committed, which was killing his father and marrying his mother. But the real Oedipus complex is what we just talked about, this disbelief, general disbelief in precognition or ignorance of precognition, whatever you want to call it. But then we behave precognitively, and then we are led into all these ironic situations, which often cause us neuroses or traumas even sometimes, because we don't grasp that we are precognitive creatures, prophetic creatures, whatever you want to call it. But Freud, I never get tired of this because Freud's life exemplified this. He had, the one dream that put him on the map and that gave him his theory of dream interpretation was in 1895, sometime in July 1895. He has a dream about this sort of ball or dinner party, and he looks into the mouth of one of his patients and sees these various symptoms in his patient, and he wakes up, thinks he understands what the dream is about, that it's all about his own professional anxieties, but then 28 years later, he winds up with the same symptoms in his mouth, and it winds up to be his oral cancer that is like this hugely existential turning point for Freud, probably the most important, decisive turning point in his life. Was, it defined the last decade and a half of his life. Had to live with a prosthetic to replace his palate, underwent all these terrible treatments and surgeries. The dream was a premonition, but he didn't believe in premonitions. So just like Oedipus, Oedipus did believe in premonitions and thought that he could evade the prophecy. Freud didn't believe in the existence of premonitions at all, and then wound up, and living his prophecy. Now, the interesting thing is, you could say, well, this dream was a warning from his future that he should stop smoking cigars, because that's what gave him oral cancer. And had he understood this as a premonition of his future, then he would have quit smoking, because in fact his doctor, one of his best friend and doctor and one of the people in the dream, had just tried to convince him to quit smoking for his health. And he had just resumed smoking and felt guilty about that. so this situation sparks a dream that's a premonition of the oral cancer he's going to get. Had he seen clearly, had the dream been his older self walking up to him and saying, you're going to get oral cancer because of your smoking, so you need to stop smoking, well, he would have stopped smoking, and then he wouldn't have had cancer, so he wouldn't have had that dream. So it had to be in this disguised symbolic form. But yeah, he lived that true Oedipus, what I think of as the true Oedipus complex of being a denialist of precognition or anything like precognition, and thus living his prophecy, his dark prophecy.
Right. Well, and what's interesting about the Oedipus myth is there are at least two or more characters in that myth who, in trying to avert the prophecy, end up contributing to its fulfillment.
Exactly.
And that's which is, it's saying something about fate. And I know that this comes up, this idea of predeterminism, when we're looking at this. And, given the long self, this idea that in the block universe we are, our four-dimensional reality is already happening, or already happened in some ways, we could say. Does that mean then that nothing we do, like what's the point of, I'm sure you get this question all the time, what's the point of doing dream work? What's the point of doing something like therapy? Why not just give up the whole thing?
Well, see, what you're describing is a symbol of non-action, but it's just as freely willed as anything else. So you're taking an action, it's just you're enacting it in a sort of stage play way. Like, how would you show non-action on a stage? Well, you would have people just staying in bed, not getting up and putting on their pants and going to work in the morning, but it's all, we can't help but act as if we have free will. We can't help it. So we're going to. So we're going to do something. And what we do is going to be constrained by our preconceptions, but it's going to be also bent by our premonitions. And we're not clear about what those premonitions are. But generally speaking, and here's an important point, generally speaking, our premonitions are there to protect us. And generally speaking, our premonitions are leading us toward a positive outcome. Now, I think that for all, it's first of all, we live in a world of, billions of other creatures who are all acting in the same, all have that same precognitive apparatus. It's not like going to be glaringly obvious when we start responding to our precognition. We're not going to suddenly be supermen, because we're all doing it's there. It's part of our basic guidance system, but it basically guides us, it orients us generally toward our survival. And this, I think, is true even in those kind of exceptional cases, but that everyone has read about of people who precognize their own death or precognize their own, something calamitous happening to themselves. There are all kinds of ways in which we're still oriented towards our survival and towards hopeful outcomes. And so I always think of that great quote from what's the writer who wrote No Country for Old Men, but there's a quote from that novel: "You never know what worse luck your bad luck has saved you from." I think that's like an important thing to always bear in mind. We do not know, we can't, there is no counterfactual reality where I went left and instead of going right, or, didn't listen to that dream instead of listening to it, or vice versa. So we never know, even though our lives are going to be full of tragedy and death and loss, my presumption is that, and I think you could say this of evolution in general or natural selection, it's orienting towards survival. Survival is the compass. And even if it's just a 51 to 49% thing, it's generally orienting us towards situations in which we survive some sort of obstacle or threat. And I have that, I have that faith, but it's also, I think, makes perfect sense. I think it's very reasonable to assume that, because it wouldn't have arisen in evolution if it wasn't benefiting us.
Well, yeah, there's that. I think, is it Llewellyn that worked on or talked about the theory of dreaming itself being an evolutionary process, that our ancestors evolved, that dream work or dream were preparatory, and you're taking it just, a little step further by saying, yes, the preparation is actually precognition, and it's in a way, you talked about like pre-processing, which I think is interesting because we look at dream work or dreams from the neurological standpoint. The limbic system is very involved. Mm-hmm. It would make sense to me on some level that survival is involved if our limbic system and our amygdala is involved in this process, that there's some emotional system that is picking up on data that's having a response or an interaction with that information that you've been describing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I don't think it's not just dreaming. I mean, dreaming is the elaboration of one aspect of this kind of precognitive orientation towards survival on the level of a complex organism with a very complex nervous system. But I think this goes back to the beginnings of life. I suspect that, a kind of responsiveness to stimuli was like one of the first. It was there in the earliest bacteria that were moving, and trying to evade predators and find food. I think that a kind of responsiveness was there already in very simple creatures. So I don't think that this is actually a highly evolved thing. I think that it's in fact a very primitive aspect of life itself that gets elaborated in various ways in more complex creatures.
Through the systems that we have of interpretation, which is very interesting that you're saying, hey, I think this is something that's there from the beginning, that this is part of the natural selection, what allowed whatever entities or life forms to pass their genes on or to pass their processes on was this pre-responsiveness. Mm-hmm. So what about for people? I just want to touch on this idea that, okay, someone's dreaming of a car crash. If people think that, okay, this is going to be what happens to me, that could create some kind of chaos, because I think people are very often dreaming about catastrophic events, or, people with nightmares, for example. They're having experience of very threatening experiences. So how do you speak to that? I know we're talking about symbols in a way that the precognition that's happening is being symbolized. But I just wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different answers to that. For one thing, many people's dreams are full of catastrophes, and the way the dreaming brain processes stimuli, and including future stimuli, is to put yourself in the story. Like a lot of my dreams, a good percentage of my precognitive dreams, and I've had I've recorded hundreds over the past, decade and a half. A good percentage of them are things I see on Twitter the next day. There are some picture or video or some interesting something that catches my eye on Twitter. I'll realize, oh, that's what that dream was about. In the dream, though, I will have been in the thick of the action. So it's like you don't have dreams about just watching passively some scene. You have a dream about, say you have a precognitive dream about, an explosion, a bomb explosion or whatever. Well, in the dream, you're going to be there, dealing with that bomb. You're going to be running, evading the bomb or whatever. So there's that aspect of it. We don't dream about things, that happen to other people. Generally, they're happening to us in the dream, even if they're happening to other people in reality. So that's one answer. But we also dream about what ifs. So, and here's another time loop example. So let me use the example of Jesse Ridgway. He's a filmmaker, a YouTuber, kind of very prominent YouTuber who made a film a year ago called Don't Dream About Me. And he's had a lifetime of precognitive dreams, and he's basically in the film trying to understand them. Well, one of his dreams was he had a dream that this older coworker of his was making a turn across traffic into the parking lot of their workplace, and a red truck slammed into her, and killed her. He had this very vivid dream, and he wrestled with himself about whether to tell her about this dream. This is a very common dilemma that people have when you dream about something bad happening. It seems very vivid, and like he knew that he'd had precognitive dreams, so he was like worried that, oh my God, this might be a precognitive dream. And so he opted to tell her, and she thought, well, that's interesting. That's funny. Well, I think a couple weeks later, she was at that exact intersection or that place to turn left across traffic to get into the parking lot, and she pauses because she recognizes, oh, this is where Jesse dreamed about me. She looks up, this red truck comes barreling past her, and had she not hesitated in that moment, she might well have gotten hit by that truck. Now, we don't know that would have happened, but her being put on alert, she attributed his dream to her survival. She said, you saved my life with that dream, which is, again, another example of that time loop. But the dream was not fully accurate. The dream was of her getting hit and killed by the car, whereas, in fact, she used that dream to survive, and not get hit. But a lot of what we dream, and I think a lot of the content of those calamity dreams that people have, is what ifs. What if, if I had not done that, here's what would have happened. I mean, we have very vivid most people have very vivid imaginations. And when we have a close call of any kind, your mind immediately goes to the worst possible outcome. And I think it's those outcomes, those imagined outcomes, that are very often the target of precognitive dreams like that. There's a famous precognitive dream case in one of Louisa Rhine's books. She was the wife of J.B. Rhine, the pioneering parapsychologist. But she wrote about this dream in which this woman wakes up in the middle of the night from a dream in which the chandelier or the ceiling light fixture in their nursery had fallen and killed their baby daughter, I guess. And her husband tells her, oh, just go back to sleep. It was just a dream. But she goes, no. So she gets up, retrieves her baby, and brings the baby into bed with them and goes to sleep. And then 2 hours later, that light fixture crashes into the crib. Would the baby have been killed? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. But she was dreaming about a what if, But that dream, in the time loop fashion, got her to take action, which made the outcome much less horrific than it might have been. And I think, I think that's, that's where I think that survival aspect comes into play. And I think that, our lives, we live in this world where we're inundated with information, and most of the information isn't relevant to our survival. It's just interesting, and we're fascinated, stuff we see on the internet or TV or whatever. But I think if we were, hunter-gatherers living in a very survival situation where predators are real threats, and where there are all kinds of real threats, and the world is relatively simple. There isn't full of like bombarding information. I think you can imagine where that kind of scenario would be incredibly common, and you'd have these dreams about awful outcomes that were narrowly avoided because of the dream in a time loops kind of way, but that where you wind up again on dreaming about this margin between death and destruction, or you're not going to have precognitive dreams about things that don't matter or don't affect you in some way. They're going to kind of steer you just past calamities, just generally speaking. So,
do you make a distinction here between precognition and possibility, meaning showing a possible outcome? I know that typically in the model that you propose, it's showing us, it's giving us information about the future in a way that then in the time loop allows us to act. It seems that you tend to move away from the idea of possible outcomes, multiple timelines, things like that. Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, a lot of people who write about this topic think that, that dream, Jesse's dream was a dream of an alternative timeline in which, his coworker was actually killed by the truck. And so he changed history somehow, or he created to avoid the paradox, he created a different timeline that coexists with that one, or, the woman with the light fixture, she created a different timeline. There's a timeline out there where her baby was crushed to death by the chandelier, and she was then living in a different timeline. It's like, well, what does that do for us? I mean, again, for various reasons we could go into, and it'd be a long conversation. There are certain people in physics who really favor this kind of many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, and that's what we're talking about here. And it's very intuitive for people. Like, let's think of dreams as kind of like this radar for counterfactual outcomes, and it helps us choose the right timeline or something. I think that if we want to really be accurate, that's not what's happening. And I honestly think that precognition is a completely separate system. I think we have really two guidance systems. We've got a kind of, I shouldn't say irrational, but we've got a kind of more conscious guidance system that is seeking to protect us based on prior information. And that's that kind of predictive processing that is kind of the main sort of dominant paradigm, I think, in cognitive psychology right now.
Problem solving, but predicting future outcomes based on crunching the data of past experience. Okay, I think that certainly works, and that is a very important part of our guidance system. But that's a very conscious aspect of often a very conscious aspect of our attempting to navigate life. Precognition is completely separate from that, and it's responding or presponding to actual future outcomes in a less than clear fashion. Whereas this conscious system, that's the system where you're awake at 3 a.m. like ruminating over, oh my God, the light fixture needs to be screwed on tighter, or oh my God, I'm gonna get some disease, or oh my God, I'm gonna go broke. All the kind of thought processes
that where we're thinking about outcomes, thinking about how to avoid catastrophe, thinking about how to prepare for catastrophe. That's a separate system, and that's I think a much newer system in evolution. Certainly no better or more important, but it's certainly kind of more. It's newer. It's sort of more characteristic of, higher primates and stuff. So I think that those counterfactuals that you're talking about, those belong to that system of like imagining outcomes and imagining courses of action and how they would lead to different outcomes and trying to choose the best one. But I think the counterfactuals that inevitably appear in precognitive dreams are not actual. They don't actually exist anywhere. There's no actual universe out there where those counterfactuals are real. I mean, it would be absurd to say that they were. I mean, then you'd to take that to its absurd conclusion. It's like there are a million timelines out there where I, showed up at work without my pants, or so it's just ridiculous. That makes no sense. Why would the universe do that? It's not very efficient of the universe to have infinite timelines that include me showing up to work without my pants, that's or whatever, it's like that's I like I guess the scientific part of me likes parsimony. All right, the simplistic explanation, which the least moving parts, is more likely to be correct or closer to correct, and the precognitive model that I outline in my books that really kind of rejects that many worlds interpretation, I think is much more parsimonious than other models.
Good old Occam's razor. I suppose during the pandemic, if one was working from home, they theoretically could show up without pants. But that
yeah, I did a lot. Just like all those Zoom meetings. Who knows? I'm. Who knows what I'm wearing right now below the...
That's a very conditional reality, I suppose we could say.
Right.
So obviously we could split hairs on this for quite a while. I guess if we stay with this example for just one more question here, what is it then that makes that dream precognitive as opposed to showing a possible outcome? Even if that possible outcome isn't a separate universe with a timeline.
No, I hear exactly your question. I know exactly what you're getting at. And there is a big gray area where you can't, theoretically, you can't tease out, did I just, predict that I might be in an accident at that particular intersection because it's kind of a dangerous intersection and it would be easy. There's not much visibility and it'd be easy for a car or a truck to come, barreling at me while I'm making a turn, so I need to be careful. Versus a dream where it's very specific. It's a red truck, specifically. It's those details that are so prevalent in precognitive dreams. They're things that could never be predicted. It's those irreducible, specific, idiosyncratic details that are the tell, I'd say, of a precognitive dream, and they're always there. I never have precognitive dreams about things that I could predict. Never. I mean, it's always something weirdly unpredictable. And I think that points to this being a completely separate system from the system that envisions possible outcomes. Worrying about getting hit at a certain intersection, it's not the color of the truck, or not the color of the vehicle, the type of vehicle. It's those specific details that are always there. And it's one of the reasons I love Freud, because his method of free association or dream, analysis or interpretation involved that kind of free associating on these very specific details. These, dreams, when you drill down, if you write down the dream and then start free associating, it's like they are packed with incredibly specific meaning. And just as long as you don't go at it with the assumption that you're going to be able to decode the dream then and there, because it's only about your past, as Freud thought, get rid of that assumption. But those details are crucially important, and it's what I like about this kind of long self framework is really paying attention. It really, when you do precognitive dream work, you see how your life is this landscape of these irreducible little details that seem trivial on the surface, but are really full of significance and meaning. And it gets you to sort of pay attention to that stuff. That's why I don't like Jung as much, because Jung kind of carries you away to this kind of realm of archetypes, and so sort of a cookie cutter framework. He wasn't interested in the details of his patients' lives and the intricacies of their lives. He was trying to fit them into patterns. I'm not interested in that. I think the Freudian, delving into the muck and the dirt and the detail is really where it's at. It's okay. It's not all sexual the way he thought, but it's meaningful.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Jung actually did endorse a teleological model, which is, different than the more reductive model that Freud had. And I get what you're saying, that there's something that if we're trying to force someone into some mythological pigeonhole, so to speak, that that has its own kind of reductiveness. Can you describe the difference between precognition and presentiment?
Well, precognition is just the umbrella term, and it's kind of a boring word. I wish there was a better word for it, but
you can make one up.
I could, but that's not always a successful gambit.
That's a risk.
I know. Yeah. I've got friends who make up terms in their writing, and the terms don't stick, and it's like, I don't want to do that. Yeah. There are a lot of synonyms for precognition. So presentiment being feeling the future. That is to say, getting some inkling of something that's going to happen, through your feelings, having a gut feeling about something, not a necessarily vivid dream or whatever. Yeah, it's one avenue through which precognition manifests on a daily life. This is not just about dreams. Dreams, I recommend dream work because that's the easiest, most reliable way for an average person to get in touch with their own precognitive capacities is through dream work. They're going to have vivid experiences of precognition doing that. But presentiment is probably the more kind of constant in our lives, and we're guided by gut feelings and emotions, and often sort of negative emotions kind of precede something negative happening in our life by half hour. It's really interesting. Of that. Yeah, it's really interesting the way it happens. That's what that presentiment refers to, that kind of feeling level, awareness, not even awareness. It's just like intimations, I guess, of things that are going to happen. Another term, premonition, is a kind of a synonym, but then that has kind of a negative connotation of, warning. It means forewarning. So, you talk about a premonition of, Aunt Hilda, dying, but you don't talk about a premonition of, winning the lottery. It's has kind of a negative connotation. And then prophecy is another term which has a more literary and religious kind of tone to it. But these are all synonyms basically, but they kind of highlight different aspects of the phenomenon.
presentiment seems to me to be the dominant channel that I experience these kinds of phenomenon. Similar to what you said, it's like it typically will show up something in my body, and then maybe an image or something like that can happen. So
yeah. Well, one of the pioneer researchers on the pioneer researcher on presentiment is Dean Radin, the parapsychologist who's associated with IONS in California.
Yeah,
but
it's right up the road here.
Oh yeah, he did fascinating research in the 1990s, showing physical responses to aversive stimuli. Things, and we're talking generally on the scale of like milliseconds, but changes in skin conductance, heart rate. People have expanded on his research and looked at brain waves and pupil dilation and all kinds of physiological autonomic things that precede a rewarding or aversive stimulus in experimental situations. Again, these are very short time spans, so that kind of doesn't interest me as much because I'm like more interested in kind of longer term precognition. But yeah, this stuff this is totally real. And then there's a lot of people who've built on his research, doing this is something that's relatively easy to study in the lab. So this is probably the best studied aspect of precognition is presentiment.
One last philosophical question, and then we'll get to the pragmatic.
Okay.
So, in the tautological perspective of causation, we could say, does that negate other forms of causation? I mean, I'm thinking, I have some background studying Buddhism. I'm thinking of how central cause and effect is to that tradition. And the idea, it's the Buddha's interpretation of karma, that basically that intentioned action is cumulative, more or less, that it generates and influences the mind stream, which it's interesting, this idea of mind stream. It's not exactly, I don't think in a Buddhist sense, it wouldn't be identified the same way you're identifying long self, but there's a stream implication there. Yeah. I don't know. I just wonder if you could speak to some of that.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this over the years, and thought of writing, kind of something more specifically about how this relates to Buddhism, but I've never sort of gotten my thoughts, sorted out yet to do that. I first of all, I'm not a big believer in intention. Okay, so I call myself a Zen practitioner. I'm really more of a Zen Taoist than a Zen Buddhist, probably. But I'm not really a believer in intention. I think intention, and for that matter, most common psychological states, or whatever you want to call them, I think they're often misrecognized premonitions or misrecognized precognition, that our intentions, things happen, things arise, thoughts arise, that we don't will, and that when you drill down in meditation, I routinely have the experience that I'm not the master in my house. It's not even a question of there being an unconscious in addition to my conscious mind, but I realize that my conscious mind is at root, I'm just taking credit for body movements and utterances and things like that I'm not initiating consciously. It's all unconscious. It's all, and so, I can say, if I'm a high agency person, I can say that I intend to do blah, 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 and, I'm always skeptical of that. I think that the unconscious is ruler. It's one of the reasons I don't really like the term conscious. Everyone talks about consciousness these days, and I, especially in the kind of paranormal discourses that I sort of participate in, it's all about consciousness. And it's like, yeah, no, it's not. I don't believe that at all. I think, we don't, no one knows what consciousness is, first of all.
Yeah.
And we don't have an agreement of definitions. And, people just like the sound of it. People like the sound of consciousness, and they take, evidence from parapsychological phenomena, for instance, ESP phenomena, as evidence somehow that consciousness is what is at the ground of reality, or that it's basic somehow. And it's like, I don't believe that at all. I mean, ESP, and specifically precognition, is almost entirely an unconscious thing. I mean, it manifests in all the ways. Here we get back to Freud. It manifests in all those ways that interested Freud about the unconscious. Okay, it's like dreams, slips of the tongue, creativity, physical symptoms, neuroses. That's how precognition manifests. It's like I can't consciously sit here and look into the future, and have this conscious vision of the future. And I mean, even, remote viewers and people who are trained in kind of intentionally using ESP, they generally are getting into a hypnagogic state, or getting into a kind of a trance state where images are arising that they did not produce, that they did not consciously produce. And that's where that's where the sweet spot is. That's where the information is coming. It's arising. It's not intentional. And so I'm not, this is one reason why I've never been able to get very interested in magic traditions, like occultism, that aspect of occultism. I don't find interesting, because it's very much about intention. And my belief is, I go back to, the real Oedipus complex that we talked about, that I think, when you're intending something, fate is always going to be smarter than you, and you're always going to end up, in this kind of Oedipus situation, maybe not as tragically as Oedipus himself, but the ruler is unconscious, whatever that means, and I hypothesize that the Freudian unconscious, or a lot of the Freudian unconscious, is our future consciousness, our future things we are going to be conscious of, refluxing and shaping our behaviors now, and shaping our feelings now, and bending our behavior now, and then we interpret it as intention. I'm not a huge fan of scientific psychology, because the fact that they ignore precognition means that they've got it wrong fundamentally. But there are certain aspects of the tradition that I do like, and I would cite Benjamin Libet's work. He wasn't really a psychologist; he was more of a, I guess, neuroscientist. But Wegner, sorry. Was it Wigner or Wigner? I'm forgetting, but he did work on conscious will. He wrote that book, The Illusion of Conscious Will. And, I think there's a lot of really interesting experimental evidence showing that, we are not masters in our house. I mean, you can drill down, using neuroscientific tools, and discover that when we formulate an intention, our body has already made a decision, has already engaged in an action before we are ever conscious of having an intention to move my finger or whatever. But we take credit, when it's successful, we say, well, yeah, I intended to do that. And if it's an unsuccessful action, like slipping and falling, we credit it to accident, but so I'm not a big believer in intention. I think that there's something much deeper than intention, and that we don't really know what's going on. It's an unconscious thing. So that's a long explanation of why I'm not a fan of the term consciousness. And once again, I've forgotten your question.
Well, it's it really was about this idea of cause and effect from the
karma, right?
From the more
Okay.
karmic level.
Yeah. So yeah, because you had characterized it as intentional action, and so I keyed in on that word intention. But yes, this like really throws a curveball, I guess, or puts spin on that idea of karma. And yes, I can say it really does interesting things to the idea of karma. But what exactly? How do we really need to redefine karma? That's a tall order. I don't know. I don't know. But I would say that there's a link between this kind of trickster and karma. Karma is a much cleaner, less baggage laden term, I guess, but I think the ultimate effect of being a precognitive creature who doesn't know we're precognitive is this kind of sort of way in which our lives produce ironies and repetition and all that stuff that's kind of would be included in the karmic model. But there again, I love the way Freud talks about neurosis. I love the way he talks about, traumas and unresolved traumas and neurosis and the way we kind of cycle through things. I think there's real value in that idiom, even though he didn't believe in precognition and probably didn't believe in karma. Nevertheless, there's a power to that way of talking about it. And so it would be, I guess my views on karma would be kind of mixing up those ideas of kind of trickster, the unconscious, and karma.
Well, that could be a very interesting comparative analysis. In some of what you're saying about volition, I mean, if I'm just taking the Buddhist lens, it's not so different from the conception of no self. Of course, they talk about it in a specific context there, but the concept of an agent, what you're kind of pointing to, the absence of an agent, that it's not so different there. Of course, there's a lot of granularity in that tradition as well. So very interesting stuff. So for someone who is interested in exploring precognition, precognitive dreams, I know one of the first things you recommend is keeping the journal. This is, of course, as a way to track. Are there other recommendations that you have for folks who are interested in exploring this?
Yeah. So dream journaling in general, like hugely valuable. Creativity, do an art. I think the other way that this manifests, and my last two books were really, or two of my last books were on this, how precognition really manifests in creativity. So, if you're interested in this stuff, then you probably already have a craft or an art that you practice. Like, really pour into that. Really, really take it seriously. Well, not seriously. Take it playfully, but do it. Make room in your life for your creativity, and because this is how. I mean, I've heard so many stories, amazing stories of people who've, basically written about future events in their, fiction, or, painted something that turned out to come true, or it happens with every medium. I was a few months ago, I was talking to a dancer who wrote this dance that essentially precognized these very significant events in her life some months later. It's like no matter what the medium you work in, do your creative thing, because that's getting inspired and working it out some way in writing or whatever is a kind of way of dreaming while awake. And so, and it's just as full of that precognitive stuff. I got that would be my big recommendation.
It's like it gives it a channel to move into, something that keeps the information flow open, so that there is more of a reflexivity or just a witnessing awareness. What about, is there anything coming up that you want to share? Any work that you're doing now that you're wanting to share about?
You know, I'm sort of between things. My last book, which came out at the beginning of 2025, Where Was It Before the Dream, was sort of the culmination of, you know, basically this all came to me, those first 5 books all came to me like basically over the span of a couple months in, you know, 2016 or something like that. And it took me almost a decade to get the argument out there and get all parts of the argument out there. I mean, I was like especially interested, you know, I was especially interested in the creativity part, but I wound up sort of taking a year to write a book about dreams because people were asking me about dreams so often. But the creativity stuff and then applying my model to literary criticism, which was that book, Where Was It Before the Dream? It was sort of was a big bolus of ideas that all sort of landed in my lap all at once, essentially, about a decade before. And so since then, it's been this incredible relief. You know, I won't use the obvious metaphor here, but it's like I took a great big dump, and it was like, oh, that feels good. Anyway, so I've been like, you know, like trying to figure out what to do next, and I have a lot of like half-written articles and stuff on my hard drive, and so I'm gonna like work through them. I've got some more artists I'm gonna deal with. I'm writing something about David Lynch right now, who's you know, he's figures prominently in my book From Nowhere, but there's so much more to be said about David Lynch as a precog. So I'm going to be writing more about him. There's a few other artists I really want to tackle. But I think the next book is probably going to be about retrocausation. It's probably going to be coming back to this focus on what we got wrong about causality. With the quantum revolution. And, you know, I say this as I'm not a quantum physicist, but I've spent enough years frustratedly reading popular expositions of quantum physics by writers and physicists who are basically in denial of this. And it's very Freudian, this kind of denial. Again, it gets back to this question of taboo. What is the fucking taboo of retrocausation? I mean, it's, you know, I spend a lot of time in time loops talking about it, but I think there's a lot more to be said more directly, and in a book that's really just devoted to that topic and not getting distracted by dreams and artists and stuff like that, but just focusing in on the sort of metaphors that implicitly guide us in thinking about causation, and how we can think in a new way about causation that kind of opens up people to realizing, oh, you know, things like precognition and time travel are not absurd ideas. They're like, they're staring us in the face. They've been staring us in the face all along, and we've lacked the right metaphors and the right lenses to see it. But so I think my next book will probably be on that. But I'm also, you know, I've been slowly working on something about Zen too, so it might, I don't know. So I'm working on a bunch of stuff, but diligently.
Well, that makes sense given your diverse interests. And it's clear that just reading your work, one of the main points that you're trying to bring to people's attention is that, hey, this stuff's actually normal.
Yes.
This stuff's normal. Yes. You can follow it. You can track it. Here's some ways you might see it and notice it. And I think that's powerful.
And that you had asked in one of our emails, you had talked about how this would apply in a clinical situation. I think that's my number one answer, that you know, I get so many emails from people who've had a precognitive dream, and who wonder, like, why me? Why is this happening to me? I'm watching, and when you don't have a concept of precognition, when you've never even heard that word, like most people haven't,
It's repressed, as you said.
we're all unfortunately repressed by our sort of, I hate the term gatekeepers, but the sort of psychological scientific gatekeepers, keep this idea repressed. And as a result, people don't have anybody they can talk to when something like this happens. So there are very few clinicians, and I'm sure you're an exception, but there are very few clinicians who are receptive at all to the idea, well, I had a dream about, a car accident, and then the next day it happened, and who are really puzzled by these occurrences, and they can't talk about them. So A, normalizing it is really important. B, one of the most common themes in the emails I get is, oh, I had a dream about my friend dying, and then he died, and did I cause that? Or
Survivor's
should
guilt.
I have said, yes, should I have said something? Is that, like, they are wrapped up with guilt about this? And again, this is so common, even in the literature of precognitive dreaming. It's like it's the number one thought process that goes through your head when you have a precognitive dream about some tragedy that then comes true is, well, you only were aware, first of all, oh, I should have known that dream was a premonition, and thus I should have done something, or maybe I should have, I'm guilty, I should have done something, or I'm guilty for putting that intention, to get back to the word, I put that thought out into the universe and it caused it. All of these thought processes that are totally false, but that leave people with guilt and uncertainty and so on. Again, because we're in a culture where who can you turn to and get advice on or guidance on this? It's to answer those kinds of emails that I wrote my second book, Precognitive Dreamwork and the Long Self. I mean, that's why I did a book specifically on dreams, because it is such a common, I would say that kind of guilt feeling, that kind of confused guilt feeling, is the number one adverse mental health consequence of precognition and a culture that doesn't understand it.
Right.
Doesn't understand it.
And people personalize the responsibility.
Right. Yes, but it can also happen in the opposite way, which is equally dangerous. So like right now, my wife and I are watching a documentary about this cult leader who sort of, when he was young, he had a dream about his parents dying, and then the next day they were killed just right the way it happened in his dream. And he went on to think that he was actually an alien from Arcturus, because he had these psychic powers, and it validated this sense of himself as this psychic Superman.
Inflation.
And then he sort of wound up, having these, a following of people that he was manipulating, and it's like so. And unfortunately you get this a lot again in that sort of UFO peripheral kind of discourse right now of people who have had, synchronicities, which are common symptoms of precognition when you don't realize that you're precognitive, but they've had synchronicities and they think that this is contact somehow with the phenomenon. They think that they're being addressed by, non-human intelligences, because this basic, again, because they are seeing the effect, they're paying attention enough to know that in their lives there are these magical things happening, but they don't have a framework for understanding it, or the only framework that they can grasp is this kind of ufological framework, and they think that it's connected to the UFO phenomenon. It's like, while yes, many UFO experiencers experience precognition in conjunction with it, there's, all kinds of reasons why that might be, but, you are UFO or not, doesn't matter that there's non-human intelligences out there. You're precognitive without any of that, and awakening people to the fact that they are precognitive beings, and learning to wrap our heads around what that means. And it's like really a mind-blowing adventure to do that. So there's all kinds of rewards at the other end. But yeah, there's all kinds of ways in which we can be made sick by not understanding our precognitive operating system.
Mm. Well, thank you, Eric. It's been a real pleasure.
POS, that's a precognitive operating system.
There you go. I like that. Well, and I mean, it makes sense just to, you've done a tremendous service to normalize it. And I thank you for that. I mean, it's helped me to read your material to make sense of some of my experiences. And, you know, I'm sure I'll continue to learn about it and keep on learning. So I thank you for that. And it's good to know both sides, both the risk for sort of distorting the information or repressing it, and that there's a middle ground there. We can walk a middle ground, and that this can be enriching in our lives. Anything else you'd like to share for now?
No, this has been a delightful conversation. It's nice to talk to a clinician about this stuff, because I think this is an important realm for clinicians to learn about, and we just need to get rid of the cone of silence that surrounds it.
Next week on Thresholds of Consciousness, I'll be interviewing Dr. Leslie Ellis. Dr. Ellis is an expert in somatic approaches to therapy. She authored A Clinician's Guide to Dream Therapy, which is now in its 2nd edition. Her dissertation, using focusing-oriented therapy to treat PTSD for refugees with recurrent nightmares, won the Ernest Hartman Award from the International Association for the Study of Dreams in 2015. I really look forward to interviewing Dr. Ellis, and I hope you join us.